What's up again, everyone? So, I'm going to skip ahead in these videos to my fifth post of Selected Subversion because of the recent developments regarding Trump and signing off on this wall and all this other stuff and just everything that's going on. Number 5 is specifically entitled Immigration Control, and it has to do with that because that's basically what I've been debating on mostly over the past couple weeks. Obviously, I'm against any type of government measures to control human migration. As an anarchist, a libertarian, whatever you'd like to call that. I think this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole thing and then go back to it and go through it again, just so that you can hear the whole thing as it flows. I mean, granted, it's just random quotes and whatnot, but I start off. What right does the state have to tell you that you cannot be here? Immigration and emigration are both false concepts and improper to use in regards to human movement, since countries are false concepts and those words/ideas are entirely dependent on the concept of countries. The proper term would simply be migration. As countries do not actually exist, that is to say, they are not legitimate property boundaries or constructs, there are no, quote, immigrants, only migrants who are being extorted by way of immigration laws. Individuals who say they favor immigration laws due to the potential threat of immigrants either threatening them directly or by way of voting for the expansion of state intrusion must logically advocate perpetual immigration control, for one can never know who might be a terrorist, Democrat, or Republican. It is true that migrants may one day threaten you, but immigration laws necessarily imply a threat against everyone living in the country for the potential crimes of others. It's logically impossible for state borders to be consistent with individual property rights. State borders and immigration control are conceptually an assault on private property rights by default, as the state arrogates to itself the power to decide who can and cannot live here, which includes all properties within their alleged jurisdiction, implying that no one but the state actually owns any property. The argument that immigration control can be legitimate only rings true, and I put immigration control in quotes, I should clarify that, because I'm actually talking, this is actually a different concept. But it only rings true when it comes to explicitly private communities, where there are such rules as no advocating communism for the Hoppians, if they want to, I've seen people call themselves that, are explicitly, and these rules are explicitly stated by a clearly defined owner or group of owners or tenants in common. Attempting to apply it to the current situation regarding state borders fails, since it's a false equivalency, as we do not currently live in a private community. We are not joint owners of the country, tenants in common, or any such thing. Applying the argument to the current situation can only come about through the delusion that the country exists and that we own it, the collectivist notion of the country. We are all joint owners in this entire land mass. State immigration control is simply the violent manipulation of the housing and labor markets, the manipulation of society. Immigration control advocates have gone off the deep end and begun to claim that they are the owners of all lands said to be held by the state. But the illegitimacy of national parks is not based on the fact that the state is an extortionist. It's more so based on the fact that no one actually homesteaded expanses of those lands. Apparently, they have completely forgotten about the Lockean conception of property, which itself is the logical basis for rightful ownership, production. A taxpayer is not justified in stopping an illegal from homesteading in some open forest the state pretends it owns, any more than a random capitalist or communist is justified in stopping people from homesteading such areas. Are these individuals going to show up in some former or current national park and kick someone out who has already built a home there because they were robbed by the gang called the United States and the other guy was born in Mexico? Would they do that now, as they are currently being robbed by the state? If so, then they are the aggressors, as paying taxes does not mean that you own something the state says they own but do not, just because they force you to pay and lie about their ownership. Clearly, no one owns lands which have not actually been homesteaded. If they think they own huge expanses of forest because the state robs them, then they're delusional. That's more of a throwback to feudalism than a Lockean conception of property, as they are making the claim that anyone can own land without actually laboring on it, without actually exerting their will upon it. No mixing of labor necessary by their so-called standards, which there are some gray areas in that, I'll admit, like forest preserves and things, but not. I mean, something must be done to these lands, or at least sectioned off in that sense to constitute a nature preserve, which I think a lot of people would honor that claim, even though there's no labor, because I would say that a lot of people have that value. But maybe not. So I'm going to go back. I start off with, what right does the state have to tell you that you can't be here specifically because, as I said later, a few paragraphs later, that the entire concept implies that the state is the only actual rightful owner of property. If the state can decide who can be here, and here means the entire area called the country, then the state has the right, and therefore is the rightful owner, because they have the right to exclude of all of this property. And I specifically word it towards the person I'm asking. I will sometimes say everyone or people that they can't be here, but I find that a lot of times sometimes it can be more productive if you tell them, because it does imply that the state has the right to tell them that they can't be here either if the state decides so. They would probably argue otherwise at first about because they're born here or they're citizens or something, but I would suggest that one remembers that the entire idea is only because the state says so. You're a citizen here because the state says so if you're born here, right? If you're born here on what they call their jurisdiction. They made the claim that this is their jurisdiction and that you are a citizen if you're born here. That's their so-called law and rule. Also, everything else is their law and rule regarding how to get citizenship, or if they can revoke your citizenship. So if you do something that you might even think is consistent with liberty, in fact might be, but they consider you treasonous or something, they can revoke your citizenship and such like this, or they would probably do a little bit more than that if they consider you guilty of treason. But the entire idea is just that the state is actually the rightful owner, because it's all based on their so-called rules for the area they call their jurisdiction. Now the other one, I'll reread it, I'll repeat it. Immigration and emigration are both false concepts and improper to use in regards to human movement, since countries are false concepts, and those words are entirely dependent on the concept of countries, those ideas anyway. The proper term would simply be migration, as countries do not actually exist. Well, let me stop there actually, and I have pulled up here the definitions just on Google of immigration and emigration. So immigration is primarily defined as the action of coming to live in a foreign country. And emigration is the act of leaving one's own country to settle permanently in another. So the idea that countries exist is taken as a given with both of these words here, the definitions of these words, and that's how people use them. If we think of how birds don't immigrate, they migrate, right? Because they don't have a concept of countries. And even in reality, humans don't have countries. They have a concept of a country, which is a self-contradictory delusion. And that's the second part of this, which is, as countries do not actually exist, that is, they are not legitimate property boundaries or constructs, there are no immigrants. And what I'm saying there is that the states claim that it owns this area, even though they don't word it that way, they act that way, right? If they tell you what you can and can't do, and if you can and can't be here, they can call it jurisdiction or they can call it legislation or regulation, but they're making an active claim of ownership. They're acting as if they own it. They have the right to control said land area, including what you can and can't do on it. So they're claiming that they essentially own the property. And that claim is false. So if that claim is false, and country is dependent on that claim being true, because without a country, without a so-called political jurisdiction, there is no country. That's what a country is a political jurisdiction. The concept of that the government or the state has the authority over this area, and if it doesn't, then there's no boundaries for it. There's no borders, because the borders are dependent on this concept that it has authority. So, as the state does not have that authority, and nobody does, the country doesn't actually exist. It's not akin to property boundaries, because the state really doesn't create any property, and it can't rightfully own anything because everything it collects is based on the threat of force. Its taxes, all of its wealth that it gains, it's not voluntary. So everything that it does is tainted afterwards. The state is not a rightful property owner. Not even really of the things that it builds with the stolen money that it takes, with the money that has been forcibly extracted from the so-called private sector. And so, also following in that, in the sense that they have no authority to declare anyone that anyone can or cannot be on this, because it's not their property. This logically breaks down to each individual's properties, and that's the only time a person has the right to say if somebody can or cannot be on there, that area, that landmass, whatever, is if it's actually their property. So when that boils all down, you see that the whole concept of immigration really doesn't make any sense, because you're not leaving a country, you're just traveling over sometimes things that are nobody's property. If you're flying, you're flying over barren land and stuff in the southwest so-called United States, in areas like this where there is no property. Nobody really owns that. The state doesn't own that. That's not their so-called jurisdiction or property, which is really what that boils down to. And it's nobody else's property because nobody's homesteaded it yet. So the whole concept is false. It's just migrating humans traveling over illegitimate, spurious boundaries that really are not legitimate in any sense. So a guy might go and build a fence out there, and the fence, I guess, is his property at that point. But the whole concept of it is just basically illegitimate, because it's dependent on the idea that he has the right to say that also he cannot be in your house. If you have a house, then, and somehow he does get past this guy's fence, like let's say this guy builds a fence, but he doesn't build it all the way over there, even though he considers that to be the border, and a guy walks past his fence, which is miles that way, and gets into your house because you invited him. The guy's basically still telling you that you cannot have him in your house. He's not even technically supposed to be in your house, because your house is considered to be on or in the so-called jurisdiction of the state. So no matter what, it boils down to we're all serfs, basically, or vassals at best, and the state owns everything, and it doesn't. So therefore countries do not exist, so therefore immigrants is a false concept. Now, individuals who say they favor immigration laws due to the potential threat of immigrants, either threatening them directly or by way of voting for the expansion of state intrusion, must logically advocate perpetual immigration control, for one can never know who might be a terrorist, Democrat, or Republican. This is primarily directed towards people who, they seem to be anarchists. They understand a lot of the arguments against the state, but then they would say something like they advocate immigration control in the time being because there is a welfare state. And I can see where they're coming from for that, but they're kind of perpetuating the two wrongs don't make a right fallacy. The whole thing should be dismantled. Piling another illegitimate bad idea on top of it's not going to fix the other illegitimate bad idea, which is the welfare state, because they say we can't have open immigration while there's a welfare state. But we should get rid of the welfare state. That's really the primary issue. And the thing here is that they say if we get rid of they tie it together with this concept of these people might come here and vote for more intrusive government because they're all leftists and things like that, which they're just, basically practicing some sort of political divination with that. They don't know what these people actually believe. They're just assuming that they do. I mean, you could look at polls and evidence, if you want to call that solid evidence sometimes, maybe not. That could be the case, but it's not a guarantee. And they speak as if it is a guarantee to immediately justify these actions, irrationalize them, it really is what's happening in their mind. And sometimes they'll even admit that these actions are illegitimate, but we have to do them because of the other illegitimate actions of the welfare state. When really they're just stumbling around, missing the entire point, which is, in my view, the way I would word it, is never lose focus of dismantling the welfare state. That's the whole problem, which they have completely lost focus. They went off on a whole other direction, creating problems that don't exist or potentially only exist because of the welfare state. So, let's see any other points about that one. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, they must logically advocate this, though. They could never, if a person says they're an ANCAP, that's the point of this. If a person says they're an anarcho-capitalist, or at some point they would be okay with the state being abolished, they could really logically never, they must have in their mind some sort of fantasy where the war on terror has been won, basically, where all the potential bad guys have been eliminated, and we somehow know that nobody's a potential bad guy, so now we can open up the borders because it's not a possibility that anybody's going to come over here and vote for more expansive government. And it's not a possibility if, like, let's say we achieve a stateless society, why you still could never guarantee that nobody's going to just suddenly get this bright idea like, hey, remember that thing called democracy? You know, we need a safety net, or who knows, you know, maybe, you know, we could take this thought experiment way off the deep end, though, and in the future people forgot about all these concepts or have different words for them. The language has changed, so they just keep doing the same thing. You could never logically not advocate immigration control if your justification or rationalization for it is the potential that somebody might come close to you and harm you. It just doesn't make any sense. Let's see. Individuals, okay. It is true that migrants may one day threaten you, but immigration laws necessarily imply a threat against everyone living in the country. And I continue on, for the potential crimes of others, but that part only rings true if we're talking about an individual who uses the previous rationalization that I have mentioned. But either way, that's true. There's no guarantee that you might not get attacked by somebody who happens to come over here from another side of the planet or somewhere else in the world. But immigration law, by preempting that and arrogating this power of the state to control everyone and their movements, is threatening everyone. It's threatening everyone to say you are basically committing a crime by having someone who was born on the other side of the planet in your house without my permission. That's basically what it boils down to. So it's a threat against everyone for the potential crimes of others, if, like I said, that's their rationalization. Either way, it just doesn't make any sense because you're threatening everyone. And if you don't use that rationalization, though, it almost kind of seems, now that I think about it, to make even less sense. So it makes sense that they would have something to rationalize it, some sort of excuse. But they're threatening everyone in the country because somebody might drift across some land over there and wind up in your house and work for somebody without paying taxes, I guess. And then, of course, go and leech from the welfare system somehow, even though he has no identification or he's an illegal, which could happen. He might be able to defraud it, or somebody might just hand it to him. But either way, these are all possibilities. They're not guarantees, and they do not justify government control of human migration. It just doesn't justify it. Two wrongs don't make it right. It's still illegitimate, just as the welfare state is illegitimate. Nothing has changed. The logic, the problem of the state has not changed. It will not change by adding more of the same problem. You're just threatening force on everyone for moving around, basically, at this point. Oh, I kind of lost my place here, clicking around. And here, I guess I'll just repeat this, and maybe if I can come off with another point, but it's just all tying it together. It's logically impossible for state borders to be consistent with individual property rights. State borders and immigration control are conceptually an assault on private property rights by default, as the state arrogates to itself the power to decide who can and cannot be here, which includes all properties within their alleged jurisdiction, implying that no one but the state actually owns any property, because if they have the right to exclude, then they are the owner. If they have the right, they are the rightful owner. The argument that immigration control can be legitimate only rings true in private properties. And this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, the argument that Hoppe makes about covenant properties, it only rings true for explicitly private properties. That is not the situation we find ourselves in. Most especially not because the state has said so, which is basically the only reason anybody believes that, or continues to believe it anyway, because of this nonstop propaganda and belief being pounded on everyone's skull. But it's like they're justifying it because it is, so because they act that way, well, we must, so it's okay to regulate immigration because we live in a covenant society, and we don't live in a covenant society. And this is with the helicopter thing and throwing communists out of helicopters, which the more rational ones, they just kind of use it as a poke because of the communists always talking about gulags. But some of them seem to really be out there and believe this stuff. It's like, if there's a group of communists in their current situation that we live in with no explicitly legitimate legitimate, explicitly stated rules regarding property and tenancy and common clauses in like a homeowners association type thing. If there's a group of communists having a meeting somewhere and they're talking about abolishing capitalism and you go and throw them out of the helicopter, obviously you are the insane fascist, communist, whatever you want to call that. You are the one initiating force for somebody simply talking about ideas. And of course, most of the time, don't even understand what they're saying, don't even understand what they're really advocating. You know, when you found out, if you are considering yourself an anarchist, when you found out what government really was, you obviously stopped believing in it. So if they know and they still believe, then that's a different story. They're kind of potentially a threat, but that still does not justify force because someone is talking about abolishing capitalism. You have to really look at the example of the threat that they're levying, you know. Let's see, where was I going with that, and where was I at? So yeah, the Hoppe argument about covenant properties. It's okay for an explicitly private community to have such rules as you can't be a communist, but it's not okay for all of you guys to just declare that unilaterally across the entire so-called country and your current neighborhoods and things like that, because then you're just doing the exact same thing as the state would do, which is arrogating to yourself the power to decide what everyone can and can't do on their property, because we don't exist in a covenant situation. And applying it that way, applying the argument to the current situation can only come about through the delusion that the country exists and we own it. So there's still some delusions to shed there. If a person says these things and really believes them. And I say that with no worries about being contradicted. I mean, I see no other way that a person could possibly try to justify those actions unless they believe the lie that we are joint owners of all of this property, which is clearly false. Especially like if you're just some person watching this on YouTube, we don't know each other and we have no property in common. There's no way that this could be the case. The state just says that and then acts like they own it and tells us that we're the owners, but it's a complete lie top to bottom. State immigration control is simply the violent manipulation of the housing and labor markets, the manipulation of society. And it trickles through the economy further than that. But the general idea, right, is they're controlling the housing market because they're basically telling everybody who they can and cannot sell to, who can and cannot occupy certain housing or housing in general, and who can and cannot work or who can seek employment, basically. So the housing and labor markets seem to be the first ones that are immediately affected, in my mind. But this trickles down into everything, you know. I mean, those are two so incredibly important and intertwined markets that it has pretty profound effects. I mean, even just illegal immigration has profound positive effects in the sense that these commodities are being produced for less cost, at a lower cost. So, you know, this translates to good things for the consumer, obviously. But again, it's no different than any other type of market control. The state's main agenda is controlling the market. Even if you just say you're a minarchist, you want the smallest possible, only defensive government, it taxes. Therefore, it forcibly reallocates private capital against its will to its own ends. So no matter what, the state is always going to manipulate some market or another. Free trade, voluntary production and trade between individuals. And, you know, it might not necessarily bear repeating, but immigration control advocates have gone off the deep end and begun to claim that they are the owners of all lands said to be held by the state. This came up as a specific argument. If you just outright ask them, are we the joint owners, or are you the owners of the lands held by the state? This is kind of a counter argument to people who take the argument that the taxpayers, having been extorted, are entitled to ownership in certain endeavors of the state, which I would generally agree with. I would not be opposed to that type of situation where taxpayers are reimbursed through ownership of what is largely becoming nationalized industries and things like this. If the logistics of that are feasible, I would not necessarily be opposed to that. So, but this rather is an argument against kind of, people seem to take that argument to the wrong end when it comes to the national parks and things like that, things that the state says are its property but actually are not, and things that the state says are private individuals' properties but really cannot logically be that either. So if you could get into the debate and you could try to ask questions which would get them to act as if they were the owner of the national park, though the reason that the state does not actually own the national park is not because it's an extortionist, though it is, it's because no one has actually homesteaded those lands. If anything, a taxpayer would be entitled to ownership in the very closest area to any amenities that have been actually constructed by the state, and I'm sure some feasible distance and preserve area or anything like that would be worked out through the market naturally if people started going in there and homesteading, but there are already individuals there claiming ownership. But to claim the entire expanse is the property of the taxpayers is false and faulty logic and not consistent with Lockean property concepts, because nobody actually homesteaded the entirety of those lands. The state essentially just declared that it owned that entire forest or whatever, and then lied to you guys, the taxpayers, and got us to believe that we are actually the owners and they're just the stewards, basically, our public servants, right? But all of that's false. So, you know, again, the logic behind taxpayers being reimbursed for tangible production and industries that the state has subsidized or things like this, that's true to a point, but when it comes to the national parks type argument, that doesn't ring true for the reasons I've stated. So that's about it. I mean, I could keep going off. I've got another one about property feuds that kind of has to do with the whole problem. A lot of the immigration control problem does stem from, or is coupled with, the belief that just declaring things are yours, like vast open expanses of lands, makes it so. And so that's why a lot of that talked about that aspect of the issue, though the entire issue is just that the belief that the state owns everything. And when you realize that the state owns nothing, and it all boils down to individual private property rights, there's really no way to justify government border control, as it is an assault on the entire concept that you have private property rights. Since the state is telling you, one, who you can and cannot have in your house, two, that you can't even be in your house if they decide not to. And again, that's why I framed the first part of it. What right does the state have to tell you that you can't be here? Because it does apply to them. The state is the one who gets to decide who can and cannot be a citizen, and upon what criteria. So I guess that about sums this one up. I feel like I have a lot more to say about this, but I don't want to lose focus too much and just be rambling. It's already been 28 minutes now. So, yeah, thanks for watching, and I really like debating this stuff, so if you've got any questions or comments, let's, try to talk about this and see what we can come up with. All right, peace.